Namaste and welcome to Urban Chatterati. Today I'm joined by Aarti Tikoo Singh, senior journalist and someone who is known for speaking her mind. Aarti, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Abhinav. It's really wonderful to talk to you on this platform for the first time. And it's an honor and privilege to be with you today.
Thank you, Aarti. Thanks a lot. And all thanks to the audience for making this platform grow. So, Aarti, when we talk about the media scene today, there is one new industry which has grown in the last few years, which is called fact checking. You have lots of fact check happening, fact checkers which are going on. What is that all about?
Abhinav, sometimes I do wonder about the traditional media that I grew up in and I was trained in. Because you see, even though I call myself modern and I would say that I am both a beneficiary and a product of technological advancement in the world, I would still say that I am very old school because my basic training as a journalist came from the conventional legacy media. And by that, we meant that media was a one-way street. And most people don't realize today that there was a time when dissemination of information was coming. It was always top down approach. It was always coming from the authorities, from the power structure, and coming down to people. But in the last, I would say, 10 years or so, media has become a two-way street, because there is a constant exchange and reaction from your audience, from your reader. So when we were trained in journalism, there was no concept as this, alt news, for example, or fact checking from a different platform or a different department within the organization, for example, wherever I worked. It was not like that. Fact checking was the basic of journalism. It was an inbuilt by default. It was a component of collecting information, cross verifying it, checking it with your sources, and then getting official versions. Or if you are doing a story on a certain controversial issue, you would get both sides. You would get the opposition and the person in question, and you would have a proper template of a story. So this fact checking is essentially an extension of what we are calling the two-way street media. When we say two-way street, we are saying that people who do not like your journalism, people who do not like what you are saying, people who do not agree with your narrative building, uh, are going to question you in one or the other way, and then they're going to say that it's fact checking. Uh, so what I mean by that is that, look, when media was only disseminating information that it thought was appropriate for its audience and readers, we did not have any fact checking missions or missionaries around us. Now we have these missionaries because they realize the two-way medium, the two-way street medium has demolished the old traditional structure of where information was coming from one source and it was going to people without anyone countering it. Because the only counter you had, for example, when you had newspapers, big national newspapers, you used to write a letter to the editor, and if ever you got lucky, your letter would get published in the newspaper in that small column. So out of millions of people in the country, one paragraph counter to newspapers' approach to the dissemination of information was carried. But that model has changed because people are constantly questioning the narrative that is coming, that is being inculcated, that is being handed out to people. Since people have risen out of their ignorance and they are now aware, know what facts are. They are constantly also empowered by social media, empowered by 24 hours news channels, empowered by blogging, empowered by writing under their own names with, different on different websites, which is all for free. So there is constant questioning, and it hurts that power structure to see that the information in which they had built in a narrative is being questioned. So they have to do some, so they came up with this idea that let's do fact checking, because their narrative is being questioned, and it's somewhere damaging their political interests. It is harming the narrative they wanted to send out, they wanted people to believe. And therefore, we should create an alternative platform which should debunk this reaction from people, reaction from audience, that the audience, what we say, democratization of news, democratization of information, and also counter questioning of narratives. This is essentially harmful to power structures. That is why fact checking. Now, if you, I would say, when you have a democratization of news, you should have multiple fact checking platforms, because we have several power structures as well. Many people think that that once you are out of power, for example, in an electoral democracy, you are simply rendered powerless. But that is not true. The way media has functioned globally, the way media has functioned in advanced Western democracies and also a developing country like India, you have to understand the basic fundamental structure to understand why I'm saying that those who uh, get removed electorally out of power do not necessarily, get are deprived of power. So I'm trying to explain the phenomena wherein how media first came into existence in democracies. If you look at some of the oldest archives in, for example, New York Times, or the Telegraph of the UK, or Time magazine, any Western magazine or newspaper, you take and you check their archives and see how they reported on, say, for Indian freedom struggle. See how they framed a language for India or countries in the East. You will notice that there was an inherent bias, that there was an inherent prejudice against societies and countries like India, because India and many other countries for at least till World War II remained under British colonial power structure. Others remained under Dutch. There were Portuguese colonies. There were German colonies. There were French colonies. So uh, colonialism era built a narrative in favor of their own respective power structures, and that is why there was an inherent prejudice against the colonies that the British colonial power, for example, in India, was ruling. So, and then you come to post 1947, post World War II, and come to, say, independent India. We inherited the same structures of media from the British. We inherited not just the printing press, not just the publishing houses, but also the overall template, overall framework of how news is to be formulated and news is to be handed out to people. Because the assumption was that people are ignorant, people are stupid, people are illiterate, and they need to be informed. So to a certain extent, that was correct. because people in India were illiterate, people did not have education, people did not have Western education, even if they had their own folk knowledge, even if they had their own traditional understanding of the world, or the scriptures which defined their world, yet they were not educated in Western framework. So the narrative handed over to Indians during the British Raj was that, the British were superior, the British were the Maibab, and they had the ultimate knowledge of sciences, of maths, of everything. And the lot of mythologies were created through that narrative, as if India, for example, had no traditional knowledge system, as if India had no scriptures which contained wealth of information, and everything that we gained, it came from the British. When we became independent, we carried on the same structure, we carried on the same formulations of understanding. And till date, I would say a lot of the English press is carrying the same mindset, same understanding, and the same top down approach, assuming that rest of India, that Hindi speakers or Tamil speakers, Bengali speakers, they don't know anything. They need to be taught, and they need to be taught the ultimate philosophy of life, or ultimate standard of life, or the way of life, which is essentially the Western way of life. So there are inherent biases. Therefore, um, that since that has happened, a lot of media got controlled by the power structures, obviously, and even after independence. And a lot of media also was under the control of the left liberal political structures. That is why, even though they are today, for example, the Congress party or the UPA, who ruled India for the longest time after independence, they still have enormous control over the narrative building within the English press. So and that their understanding of world comes only from what the Western world, or the Western value system, or the Western ideas and conceptualization of issues is. And that is why I'm saying that even though the UPA is not in power, the Congress is not in power, the left liberal ruling classes of India still control the English mainstream media, and including the fact checking platforms, because they have not really been out of that system which controlled the narrative building, which also controlled myth making. So myth making is part of narrative building. Narrative building itself is myth making at many levels. I will come to that part as well. But what I want your audience to understand today is that do not assume that just because a political party is out of power necessarily means that the mindset, the ideological disposition to a certain thinking is out of power.
So basically, you are saying that just being out of the government does not mean that you are out of power, or being in the government does not mean that necessarily does not mean that you are in the power. Power is a much wider concept, and hegemony is a very important component of the power. But when you talk about the fact checks, they claim to be debunking the misinformation spread by the IT cell of the political parties. But is it the case that these fact checkers are themselves are the IT cell of some of the other political party?
So the reason I expanded at length on the top-down approach, and why news essentially is a dissemination of information as chosen by power structures, is because I wanted to come to this point that fact-checking platform, like the rest of media, is neither neutral nor objective and nor apolitical. I would say that media, by and large, especially big media, any big media, any media which has been traditional, which has been there for a long time, and also the new media, which is sustaining on revenues only known to them, on a financial model which is known only to them, which is not transparent, which has no accountability, I would say, is a partisan media. It cannot be apolitical, it cannot be objective, it cannot uh, be neutral media. In fact, it's a misnomer and a fallacy to even think of media in the post economic liberalized world as an objective entity. It is not. It cannot be, because see, before economic liberalization, media was directly, it was seen as fourth pillar of the state, even though we called it fourth pillar of democracy, but it was essentially state media. That's why we had Doordarshan. That is why, Akashvani. So these were state entities. After economic liberalization, when we had the booming of news channels, newspapers, magazines, uh, what exactly happened? The corporate world basically made investment into media, and each corporation, which obviously is a business entity, and is tied to its own revenue interests, its own financial interests, who in turn also, of course, get tied to political parties at one level or the other, for pushing their own financial objectives and agendas. So it was inevitable that news organizations which were getting funding from corporations and from businesses will automatically have certain political leanings, will have certain political motives, even though everybody claims to be objective, neutral, balanced. And I'm including myself in this, because I do not think, and this I'm saying with a lot of responsibility, this I'm saying also in my absolute humbleness and with absolute humility, that it is it's actually a huge lie when you tell people that you are absolutely apolitical or non-partisan. I would say that for any journalist, if you have been any journalist worth his or her salt, if you have been in this profession for a very long time, and if you have worked very hard, if you have studied, if you have read enough, if you have written enough, and I'm not talking about many. There are many journalists who never write a word but still call themselves journalists. I'm not referring to them. There are many journalists who claim to be editors, but you would have never seen any of their writings. You would have never seen them talk at any platform whatsoever, but they still pretend to be journalists and editors. I'm not talking about them, but anybody who has worked hard enough, written enough, and spoken enough, and read enough will have political opinions, will have a political mind. It is inevitable, it is natural, and if you don't have that political mind, you have no business calling yourself a journalist or calling yourself an editor. The difference is that when it comes to reportage, are you maintaining the ethics of reportage, the neutrality of reportage? Are you maintaining the professional standards of collecting information with absolute honesty and disseminating it with absolute honesty? Are you also including multiple versions of the story? If you are not, then you are clearly partisan on not only in your thinking but also in your profession, and that is where many of the journalists have lost it. Many of the journalists have forgotten to draw the boundary, to draw that line. So when we are talking about fact checking platforms, you have to assume that, like the mainstream media, like the big media, they are also partisan. They also have a political mind, and they also are susceptible to break the ethics of journalism. They're not, nobody is god here, nobody is above suspicion, or nobody is above rules. So they are susceptible to that. And if you look at how some of the, for example, alt news, and I'm taking the name of alt news here, because I have been at the receiving end of its political witch hunting. Because so one of their founders, who used to run a page called Susu Swami or Subramaniam Swami, something like that, right? uh, Unofficial Swami or something. And they went after me because I have certain political opinions. I am entitled to my opinions, like everybody else in this democracy is. The question is that, have I ever crossed my ethical lines as a journalist? And my entire work, my body of work is out there in public domain. Nobody can challenge me on my reportage, because I have, with all fairness and honesty, reported facts and reported facts alone. But when it comes to opinions, I have those opinions, and I'm going to express my opinions regardless of what people think. But just because my opinions do not match yours, you will come after me and hound me. That's what the one of the founders of alt news did. Not only did they do it on unofficial Swami page on Facebook, but they did it on alt news itself. They took up absolutely trivial issues over social media comments, for example, tweets, and they created stories out of Aarti Tikoo's trivial tweet. Is that fact checking? I mean, it's ridiculous. That cannot be fact checking. That you have no business calling yourself a fact checker. You are essentially a meme checker. You're a tweet checker. You're a cartoon checker. You can call yourself you can you can call yourself all those names, but you're not in the business of professional journalism. You're not that. You are in the profession of political witch hunting, because you are selectively targeting people. You're not going after many of the senior journalists who have committed horrendous errors and made misjudgments on big stories. For example, have you ever seen alt news, for example, written anything on a story which appeared on the front page of the Indian Express some years ago, wherein the editor claimed that there was a coup attempt against, by the army against the democratically elected government of India. Now,
But was
this
alt news there back then?
even then, okay, yeah, good question, because I mentioned this story with a certain purpose. So this story came when our alt news was not there. But alt news, on the other hand, came out to rescue Barkha Dutt on a story which she had done decades ago on the exodus of Kashmiri Hindus. Barkha Dutt had made a claim in her reportage, and this is a big claim. She insinuated, in fact, she almost implied that Kashmiri Hindus, a minority community of Muslim majority Kashmir Valley, were hounded out because Kashmiri Hindus were the elite class. Now, this is a huge claim. Nobody should be taking this claim on the face value, because there is evidence, and there is massive amounts of evidence which can disprove Barkha Dutt's claim. Yet alt news, years after, comes out with a piece, fact checks this piece only because Barkha Dutt has been continuously attacked on this story. Even though it's a very old story, she has been continuously attacked on this story in social media, but alt news comes to defend her and justifies her nonsensical claim that she had made years ago. Has alt news ever questioned Shekhar Gupta's claim that there was a coup attempt against the democratically elected government of India? We haven't seen that story. We do not see. That is why I made this point. So the issue is that alt news, like other, and I'm not saying that it's the only alt news is the only fact checking platform. There are left left liberal platforms which are doing so-called fact checking for their respective political parties. There are right-leaning fact checking platforms which are doing it for the BJP, which are doing it for the Hindu right wing. And I think, in all fairness, if there is a left liberal platform doing this so-called fact checking, the right wing also has a right to have a so-called fact-checking website to do it. So,
So that brings us to this question by Shashi Dharan, because you just said both of them are doing it. Is the media susceptible to political bias, or is it just simply willing to do it?
it's both. That any media will be susceptible to political bias, but I think since the decentralization of media and democratization of information, we have seen that media has been increasingly susceptible to political bias. See, when media was an extension of the state, there was no question of the political bias because everybody knew it was the state media, and therefore there was no other version, there was no multiple versions, there was only whatever the state said was the final word on anything. You know, for example, if on I remember when we got displaced from Kashmir in 1990, Doordarshan had a very interesting way of packaging the news on Kashmir. They would keep out the sensitive information. For example, the exodus of Kashmiri Hindus. You wouldn't really see any of it in the main Doordarshan news, that there was an exodus. If you can show me one clip of Doordarshan that 300,000 people have been evicted from Kashmir, I will I'll say that I was wrong, but you won't see that. So and for a long time, if you notice that national television Doordarshan would show lot of things happening in Jammu and Kashmir, but completely blank out on say the cross border terror. They would not even show what was happening. So that was the final word of the government. But when privatization happened, we saw that everybody was coming to Kashmir, everybody was doing a story, everybody was making documentaries, and then political biases started appearing. There was media which was taking the government line as if nothing had happened in Kashmir, as if everything was hunky dory, as if militancy was completely a normal process, normal phenomena. But then there were, nobodies like me, for example, when I joined the Times of India or Hindustan Times before that. I went back to Kashmir and I dug out stories which many journalists had not done, which many people had not even read about. Often it's said that people did not know what happened to Kashmiri Pandits, and the reason is this: because media, a certain section of media, even after privatization, chose to side with the government. It was not the BJP government, by the way, right? Uh, but they chose to go with the government line. They chose to follow the Doordarshan type line on Kashmir. And then, as a reaction, many people went out to show the other side of the story. As I was growing up, I used to wonder that, we experienced a certain reality in Kashmir. We experienced exodus, we experienced exile, and we faced destitution of displacement. But none of it is being shown, and none of it was in the newspapers. I came from a family which was into newspaper business, by the way. My grandfather, for example, was one of the oldest journalists in his times. He started journalism when there was no printing press in Kashmir. So, yeah, and my family was into newspaper magazine distribution for the entire district of Anantnag in the 80s. So I grew up seeing stacks of newspapers coming to our home, magazines, and every time, I used to go to the nation pages to see if there is a column on Kashmir. And it would really surprise me that none of the newspapers or magazines were pointing out what was really happening in Kashmir in 89, for example. Later on, when we got displaced, I never saw anything on television or in newspapers which could really showcase the real picture of the ground, because the media was compliant. Media was what they call, the pliable media. It's been existing forever. It's not a new phenomenon.
Hmm.
So then, in the last, ever since social media's advent, we saw more and more people coming out, more and more people speaking out. And that's why we now have people making documentaries.
Yeah.
So
So
there is
Munish is
an
asking the
inherent
same thing.
bias.
Munish is asking the same thing which you just said. Do you think social media is a counter to biased traditional media? Does social media have deep penetration matching the traditional media? Second point is very important. How effective is social media?
See, it's funny that, yes, in a way, it is a counter to the deep political biases of mainstream media or the legacy media. But is social media a completely neutral media? I would again point out that no. Uh, there is a basic fallacy in everybody's thinking. We are hoping that there will be something called a completely neutral media. There won't be. It is an impossible thing to happen. It cannot happen ever, simply because the way media structures, media platforms are created, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, these are big financial companies today. There is a lot of money that has been invested. There is a lot of resource that has gone into its structure making. So to think that people will not make political investments in these media is, I would say, very puerile thinking. It is not correct. But to a certain level, it has it has given voice to a large section of society which did not come from the elite ruling classes. It has given voice to the subaltern. It has given voice to people like me, self made in every sense of the word. And I have had no chance, because there was a time in India, for example, in NDTV, you could not get a job unless you were son and daughter of an official, of a bureaucrat, of a politician, of a leader, of somebody of some significance. Since I come from an insignificant family background, with no patronage, with no influence whatsoever, and risen from bottom of society, I did not have a platform. I did not have a voice. But I got that voice because social media provided that voice. Now, is I would say the second part, that penetration is that does it really match the traditional media? I would say as of today it does not match the penetration of traditional media, because if you look at the penetration of, for example, regional news channels in India, it's huge, it's massive. If you look at vernacular press, again huge. But the landscape of media is changing. And even though we think that the penetration is not huge today, it is going to accelerate in the next few years rapidly. If you travel across the country, you will see that the young demographic of country, and India is a young country, we have a youth bulge, and we also have this youth bulge at a time when technology has taken off, and media, social media, internet, phones, everything, the penetration is widespread. So this generation is obviously going to be the biggest beneficiary, and therefore since it is reaching them, it has reached them. In the next 5 years or so, we will see traditional media taking a backseat. It's already taken a backseat in the
Already.
last 2 years. The print, the newspaper, the hard copy is finished. The hard copy is over. The pleasure of reading a newspaper for my generation, your generation, and generations older to us, it's gone. So we should be prepared for that scenario where the penetration is full, and it's coming soon.
I think it will be happening in the few years that more and more people. So you already have lots of people connected through Facebook. Twitter is still a bit limited, but it is going to expand very rapidly. But Aarti, when we talk about certain journalists, certain media houses who say we are speaking truth to the power, you know, and people say, "Wow, no, he's a journalist who is speaking truth to the power every day on a prime time or something." But is it not the case that the people claiming to speak truth to the power owe their allegiance to some other power?
Abhinav, even before I respond to that, I want to first dwell on this whole phrase of truth to power. So, to begin with, what is truth and what is power? Uh, when you speak truth to power, you are implying that there's a consequence, there's a price to be paid. Because when you're talking about power, power can destroy you, power can demolish you, just because you have an opinion, or just because you're speaking truth. There is a huge probability that a powerful structure will finish you off. Now look what has happened. Those who claim to be speaking truth to power, I see them. Okay, now I'm going to come to some facts, bitter facts, which most people probably don't want to listen or don't want to hear. In after economic liberalization and after the boom of news media in the country, Indian news media, which used to be till the 80s, used to be seen as a jhola chhap profession. Okay, ki if you remember, there was a time there used to be jokes on if, for example, marriage and marriage proposals for a journalist, that if you were a journalist, for example, this joke that I have repeatedly heard in my early years of apprenticeship as a journalist, that somebody would a journalist would look for a proper match, and often the family would ask that what do you do, and the journalist would say that I'm a journalist, and they would say that okay, you are a journalist, that's fine, but what is your profession, what is your salary? So that was the image of a journalist in till the 80s. But look at the image of a journalist post 1990. You will see that instantly a journalist was on hoardings, a journalist was a character in movies, and that journalist used to be powerful, and that journalist used to have immense influence on decision making, on policy making, and that journalist could do anything. How did that happen? People don't ask this question. How did that happen? Because with economic liberalization and privatization, lot of money came in through, of course, foreign direct investment also, and through corporations within the country. A lot of money was invested by different corporations. And all of it's tied to politics also, because at the end of the day, a business flourishes under a certain dispensation, because a certain dispensation will favor a certain corporation or a certain policy that will favor a certain business. So that happened, and the image of the journalists changed, because journalists were now getting massive packages, 10 crores a year, 5 crores a year, 2 crores a year, 1 crore a year. I mean, it's unthinkable amount of money when your larger sections of society are still earning meager money, despite
And
the
they may
fact that
speak
they
truth to the power,
no
saying Ambani
no
Adani ki sarkar.
and despite the fact that that there are far more qualified people, academics were not earning as much, scholars were not earning as much, but journalists were earning almost the same amount of money as actors and actresses in Bollywood. News media is not Bollywood. We don't have massive audience. News media, if you really look at their selective audience, the biggest newspaper in the country, the biggest news channel in the country, their audience is very limited. So it's a very fractured thing. Unlike Bollywood, unlike Tollywood, who have large audiences, who will go to theaters and spend money to watch a movie, we didn't have that. But there was a structure, a system which was created in a way that the top people within media industry were earning massive amounts of money, because they were peddling a certain narrative in favor of one political party or the other. And it's still going on. I'm not saying something which is non-existent. It's still happening. And then these are the people who are now saying, who have amassed massive amounts of wealth, who have bungalows, who have like half a dozen apartments across the country, who have bought wealth in Europe, who have bought wealth in properties in the US, who have apartments in Dubai, and who have investments in mutual funds and whatnot. These are the people who are now saying they are speaking truth to power. Who has power with all this
Hmm.
wealth? Who have earned, who were earning these big fat packages? Who has power? So what truth are you talking about?
I think
You
speaking truth
basically,
to power here means hounding some local politician who might be earning, who might be just struggling in his life to rise up the political ladder. So that chota mota neta making some orthodox or some crazy comments is the power, and these multi-millionaire billionaire journalists are speaking truth to the power. This is what
that is
I believe.
right. And no, but additionally, what is really happening? This truth to power is essentially, these people are peddling a political narrative to the people who are in the government as of today. Do people in the government really have the power to demolish those who are speaking so-called truth to them? I don't see anyone getting demolished. Those who were the kings and queens of the media scene in the 90s and 2000s, they are still kings and queens. They are still earning pretty well. None of them, even though many of them were indicted and accused of malfeasance and wrongdoings in several criminal cases, whether it was Neera Radia tapes, or whether it was Augusta Westland scandal scam, and many other journalists who were the beneficiaries of many other scams, uh, I don't see any of them having gone to jail. I don't see any of them, being harassed by the CBI. I don't see any of them, losing jobs just because they have certain political affiliation. Nobody has lost a job because of a political affiliation. I think they may have lost their jobs, if somebody did, only because they were caught in being in basically fixing a political narrative for a political party or a political leader. So I would say that this truth to power is good as a rhetorical phrase. It sounds very powerful because the innocent, naive, ignorant audience, especially the youth, who don't know the reality of the celebrities, and I'm saying this because even at one point of time, I used to adulate these celebrity journalists because I came from a small town, because I was a displaced Kashmiri Hindu. I grew up in destitution. I used to look up to these names and I used to think the world of them. I used to think that they are the ultimate purveyors of knowledge and information and wisdom and intellect. It's only in the last 10 years when I came to Delhi and I saw things very closely in the mainstream media, how news is manipulated, how news headlines are manipulated, how slants are fixed. That's when I understood that it's a big mess. It's
This is a
not
big
what
scam
we.
in itself. So just
It's a
like fact
scam in
checking,
itself.
speaking to power itself is a scam. But Arun is asking something on Kashmir. Uh, why suddenly all the negative reporters on Kashmir has gone? Just because it's replaced by the pandemic reporters now?
Okay, so as I was saying that during Doordarshan time, there was a certain state line on Kashmir. They may have had their own reasons, but it continued later on as well. And part of the reason was that the state somewhere decided that a certain narrative was in their interest. And when I say the state, I'm saying the establishment, the bureaucracy, the deep state, the state, and this is irrespective of political parties. Because, for example, when Vajpayee ji, even though he was running a so-called right-wing led coalition government, even during his time, we saw how the state basically provided platform and space to separatist voices way more than say the UPA government, or say even the government before Vajpayee, the era of coalition governments. So it is irrespective of the political parties. And the reason for that was that for a long time the state also believed that that India was better off being friends with Pakistan, and in that process it ceded lot of space to extremist voices in Kashmir. It ceded lot of space uh, to separatism, in fact. And separatism was normalized. It was mainstreamed by the Indian state to the extent that PDP, which played soft separatist politics, was a normal thing. It was acceptable to a democratically elected political party and the state. That changed because people like me started questioning it. When social media came, uh, I decided that if I can't get space in mainstream media to speak my mind, I should utilize this platform to say what I have experienced as a journalist and also as a Kashmiri. So I utilized that opportunity, and that's when we pushed against this state policy that separatism should be normalized. We pushed against the policy that that it is okay to to commit violence against the Indian state for say in support of separatism. So we really pushed very hard, and that's when in the last 7 years, even though the BJP came to power, we know that they allied with the PDP, which had played soft separatist politics throughout its career. This spiel was sold to Indian audience that it is good for the country. Even some of us believed it. Even we believed it, that it's all right. But at some point, we realized that there was a pattern to it. This pattern was harming India internally. It was corroding its state. The state had been weakened and sabotaged to an extent that the state could never stand for its own principles and its own constitution and its own law. So in a way, the state was, even though it is supposed to be the protector of the law and the enforcer of the law, it was countering and demolishing the legal structures. So we pushed the narrative, and that's when the BJP and the PDP coalition eventually fell apart. Lot of things happened in between, and I remember going to various public platforms, speaking my mind out that this is not done, that you are incentivizing terror in Jammu and Kashmir, you are incentivizing separatism in India, you are incentivizing this entire mindset that it is all right to attack Indian state, and democracy is not as valuable as we tend to think. So this is what they were doing, and this is what we questioned. And finally, when PDP and BJP alliance broke, I think somewhere within the government there was a recognition that many of us who were questioning the previous policies of the Indian state were saying something very sensible, that it is not all right. So then we saw a crackdown. There was a crackdown on Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front. It was banned. There was a crackdown on Jamaat-e-Islami, the political wing of Hizbul Mujahideen terror group. There was a crackdown on terror funding, which was tied to news media in Jammu and Kashmir. News media in Kashmir for 30 years, for 25 years or more, they sowed the seeds of Islamist radicalization. They sowed the seeds of hatred against India. They were peddling bigotry and xenophobia day after day after day, and it was happening right under the nose of the Indian state. So these things were questioned, and in the run up to the August 5, 2019 decision, when Jammu and Kashmir was finally reorganized, in that run up, a lot of things happened. Media also was pushed, media was questioned, and ads which went to, imagine, state was funding these newspapers who were peddling separatism against India, who were peddling war against India. Can you believe it, that Indian state was actually financing a war against itself? So that happened, and that is why you do not see a lot of negative news on Kashmir nowadays. I'm not saying that there is no terrorism, there is no radicalization in Kashmir anymore. There is, but it is not as if the entire media is now one-sided and it is promoting separatism. There is still a certain media which is being permitted to speak their mind against India. So at one level, yes, I think it's all right for a democracy to have different political points of view, but I don't think it is all right to have an unconstitutional, illegal point of view where you are backing terror organizations, where you are backing Pakistan an enemy state, where you are backing uh, forces or elements which are inimical or antithetical to the Indian state.
That's a very important point. I mean, you just explained the entire thing about the news coverage of Kashmir, but I think we will have to hold a separate discussion on Kashmir itself to talk about these things which are not, let's say, commonly talked about. But we are running out of time. We only have 5 minutes. So if anyone has any question, they can ask. And I'm sure I'm going to invite Aarti again to talk on
Thank you, Abhinav.
some other topic. So is there any question now? Okay, so I think that's the end of it, Aarti. But thanks a lot, Aarti, for discussing and giving a point of view which we don't hear even from those who criticize the fact check or speaking to power, because it's more of a rhetoric, it's more of an angry reaction rather than a nuanced analysis which you brought to the table. Thank you, Aarti.
Thank you, Abhinav. I think my last word would be simply this, that the so-called fact-checking platforms, they may try to sell themselves as fact checkers, but I think they are again under an illusion that people will not see through their fraud and their charade. People, have grown in this country. People have become far more informed and aware in this country, say, compared to what we were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So the charade cannot sustain for long. People are seeing through what they are doing. Uh, these platforms are being funded, are being propagated, backed by not just the certain ruling elite class with a certain political ideology, in this case the left liberal ecosystem, but they're also being backed by foreign agencies, foreign countries. There are international forces which would like to harm India, which would like to destabilize India. And if you really check today who are really amplifying the voices of these fact checkers on social media, you will notice that most of them are either Pakistanis, or they are bought by these so-called platforms, fact checking platforms. And therefore this fact will not remain hidden from public for long. People will see through it, and I think that will again, I'm sure of it, that that will lead to some other paradigm shift in overall social media as well. I think changes will come. We will see that soon.
We definitely need change. And thank you, Aarti. And thank you, audience, for listening to us. You have been with us for the last 58 minutes. Thanks a lot for your patronage. Hoping to see you again. Please subscribe to the channel and join as a member if you like. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhinav.